had ever really kind of informed my or changed my analysis, informed and radically kind of changed my analysis of Palestinian history, modern history, especially the Palestinian struggle against Zionist settler colonialism in such a profound way. The book is about the 1936 to 1939 revolution, but the question the book answers is, I mean, the way I remembered it kind of after reading it all those years ago was, why did the Nakba happen? Why did we lose as Palestinians and Arabs and indigenous people and the kind of working classes that the Nakba really kind of devastated? Why was it this? Why did it have this outcome? And Kanafani situates the answer in the 1936 to 1939 revolution. A very basic reading, a kind of almost like superficial reading would affect, and you'll see this in other texts maybe, is that basically the way that the British and their Zionist allies, the British kind of military occupation of Palestine, what was called the British Mandate, and their kind of Zionist cronies in Palestine, effectively kind of used this brutal force to kill, imprison, exile these kind of Palestinian communities, leaders within those communities, agents of uprising and mobilization in Palestinian communities. And so by the time we hit the 1940s, the Palestinian community doesn't have that ability to mobilize and organize in such a way as to resist the heavily armed and globally supported Zionist militias and forces that execute the Nakba, the forcible expulsions between 1947, since 1947. That's there, but I think, I mean, it doesn't even need to be that deep of a deeper reading. He opens with it. He basically says, in the years, this is how the whole text starts. In the years 1936 to 1939, the Palestinian revolutionary movement was dealt a devastating blow by the three formations that have since evolved to become the major forces working against the people of Palestine: reactionary Palestinian leaders, Arab regimes surrounding Palestine, and the alliance between Zionism and imperialism. He effectively then says that this has been the formative contradiction in what Palestinians and those kind of struggling for Palestinian liberation, and by extension, Arab liberation and liberation on a much more global level as well, because we can never forget how much of a real kind of fundamentally internationalist analysis Kanafani had in all of his work. And effectively, he's saying that this triumvirate of reactionary Arab states, the alliance between imperialism and Zionist colonialism, and because of the reactionary Palestinian leaders and the reactionary Arab regimes, this is the kind of like dynamic that's going to stick with Palestinians at least until the time of the writing of this text, and it's not a stretch to say that it is with us until now. This remains the fundamental characteristic, and it's a little bit exceptional. Right? That's the other kind of argument that he's making. He effectively, in this text, sets up what social scientists following Max Weber would call an ideal type, almost like a normal scenario, a scenario we would come to expect in colonized societies, which is that the kind of land owning, or depending on the kind of class formation that the society has, but effectively, if we want to use the shorthand, elite, the kind of wealthy elite, powerful elite, the kind of clan leaders to landholders to owners of capital and so on and so forth, will find a way to create common cause and find an alliance, common ground with the imperial power, which will then sort of transition it into what we would now call maybe like a post-colonial type of polity, where that elite is kind of running the show in cahoots with whoever the colonial, now neo-colonial type powers are. And he's saying, well, actually in Palestine, we have this actual other type of situation. The Palestinian elite, the Palestinian urban bourgeoisie and rural landholders and property owners, these men, for them, he's very clear on this being kind of clan patriarchs. These men are, there was no shortage of them begging to be the agents and allies of the British Empire in Palestine. They wanted to be the shepherds who would then get to be the kings of Palestine, or the heads of state of Palestine, and basically turn it into their little cash cow, like happened in every other country in the global south, kind of coming out of, not everyone, but most of the countries that we can think of and societies we can think of that came out from under the imperial yoke, only to have a kind of neo-imperial type formation where imperial interests of whichever of the major powers, usually the United States, that kind of profiteer off of and loot and strategically use these societies and their resources and their geographical locations, so basically, I lost my train of thought for a second, but basically that what happened in Palestine was the Zionist leadership and the Zionist movement offered the imperial entity, in this case Britain, a much more effective and useful tool for the running of this country, of this land, and then the societies and communities that are contained within it. And within that story, you have the kind of local Palestinian reactionary kind of elite, effectively kind of like begging for some scraps at that table and basically looking for any chance to just capitulate on something, compromise on something, give something away. And there's hosts of examples about particular moments in the revolution, 1936 to 1939, where they actually, like something major would happen and they'd run to London to be like, hey, look, we're the good guys, give us some power, give us some situation that we can kind of increase our own capacities and wealth and influence through. And he rightly skewers them as quite pathetic because their British overlords don't need to listen to them. Their British overlords effectively have this Zionist entity, this Zionist leadership that's going to be way better at even kind of doing that. And they have these Arab regimes that may be put in embarrassing situations from time to time, but will consistently and always work against the Palestinian masses because the Palestinian masses, if nothing else, offer the threat of a good example for their own societies rising up, right? And this has, since Kanafani wrote this text, by the way, he publishes this text about 6 months before the Israelis murder him. So this is one of the last texts he publishes in a prolific career. He dies at the age of 30, he's killed at the age of 36, and he produces mounds of material, which, by the way, we still don't even know the magnitude. We still don't, because he wrote so much under pen names, we may never know all of what Kanafani wrote in those 2 to 3 decades in which he was active as a writer. And that's just the writing. So the analysis still stands. It's actually been proven, whether in the Camp David Accords or the Oslo Accords or the Wadi Araba Accords, or in the nitty-gritty of life in Palestine today, the way that Arab regimes deal with it, the way that Palestinian reactionary leaders, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or so on, deal with it, or the Palestinian leadership within 48 occupied Palestine. It's that similar kind of dynamic constantly that he's one of the first, if not the first, to really outline in this text. And this is why this text, even though it's not a very large text, the bibliography is not massive. You can actually get a sense of how much he has learned through conversations with his elders, because the analysis that he has doesn't come just from the texts. He's using these texts to illustrate points. And he doesn't even have a full library at his disposal. He's able to take very little information that's available in the text that he does have at his disposal, complement it with what he hears from literally people who were leaders in the revolution that were with him in Syria, Kuwait, Beirut, etc., and offer this analysis that still holds until today. And it's very rare that you will find a text that's able to do this and withstand also, like continue to be able to inform very accurately political analysis of a situation like this.
Thank you so much, Hazem, for capturing the importance of the book. Again, we're talking about Hazem's translation of Ghassan Kanafani's important text on the revolt of the 1936 revolution.
The second part to your question, which is why retranslate it.
Yes, yes.
This text was translated, I think, as early as 1974, maybe 1976, 1974. Most of us know it off of a website called Marxists.org, where it has been freely available since almost the dawn of the internet. I don't know who that translator was, but major respect for the people who did translate it initially, because they did it so quickly. They did it, within 2 years of its publication, which was also 2 years since the Zionists murdered the author. And you can get the gist of the text very well. It's a very readable translation. However, there are many errors in it. As I was translating it, I actually had the 1974 translation open just to kind of compare. And in many instances, I found that there were just kind of like outright misunderstanding of the original text, for sentences and paragraphs that actually went counter to the initial intention. And possibly more importantly, because we can consider those almost minor because they kind of exist as like episodes or moments in the text, there's a broader issue that I had with the text, which was, again, Kanafani was not a Palestinian nationalist. This is something that I think is very hard for Palestinian nationalists to accept. But he was not a rah-rah Palestine, like let's all just be Palestinian, the kind of things we see, especially in the diaspora today. He was an internationalist, and he was a revolutionary in the class struggle sense of revolutionary. He did not use anachronistic terms like describing people as Palestinian nationalists at the time of the revolution, because that's not how the revolution was framed. He was actually a very advanced historian. For someone, especially as someone who wasn't necessarily trained as a historian, I've seen many trained and professional historians make errors of anachronism like this, taking categories that exist in the present and pushing them, forcing them onto actors in the past who would find them unfathomable or kind of nonsensical. So in the 1974 translation, you'll constantly see reference to things like the Arab Palestinian peasants or Palestinian national this or that. And so these choices of framing actually make Kanafani seem like a kind of Palestinian nationalist in that 1970s variant of that, which is still with us today. And it actually, I think, does a disservice to the text. He's a much more careful analyst than the original translation makes him out to be. And he sees people like the peasants and the workers and the urbanites and the rural folk, etc. He sees them as these people who are just like struggling to make do, who don't necessarily carry this sort of like a nationalistic type of consciousness. And he sees people as working in their own kind of like collective interests in many different ways. And the adjectives he uses, the descriptions he uses reflect that in a way that I think was a bit distorted. Not out of malice, but out of that was the language, that was how people talked in the mid-70s and into the 80s. And many people still kind of talk in these nationalistic, almost chauvinistic type terms. And actually, others who are contemporaries of Kanafani wrote in that kind of language. Kanafani didn't. And that's, for me, what makes him particularly special and particularly important for us to remember, because even though in many ways, he wrote the party line for the PFLP, but in his own personal writing, he didn't toe the party line for the PFLP, which is fascinating. Right? That you have someone who's considered the primary ideologue for something and recognizes that he needs to speak in a certain way when he's in that mode. When he's the editor of Al-Hadaf, he has to speak in the voice of the Popular Front. But in his own personal writing, he's much closer to being almost like an anarchist, right? There's a text. So we translated the text from the Dar al-Rimal publication of like the volume 5, which never existed before. There were only 4 volumes. They all kind of look like this. Some of you have seen them, that came out from Mu'assasat al-Abhath al-Arabiyya, the Arab Research Institute. Dar al-Rimal republished those 4 and then added a 5th volume of the kind of non-fiction political analysis works, of the Dirasat al-Siyasiyya, the political writings. And so the first text in here is actually Kanafani's analysis. Is almost like a primer on Marxism that Kanafani wrote. And it's a primer on Marxism that is far from orthodox and actually strays from the PFLP's kind of Moscow Marxist-Leninist party line. He's much more critical of vanguardism. He's quite critical of things that were part of the PFLP party line. So anyway, just to say that I think translating Kanafani needs to be sensitive. Any translator of Kanafani needs to be sensitive, not to kind of enforce upon him or sort of don him with a kind of nationalism or kind of Politburo, Comintern type Marxism, Leninism that he actually pushes against in his own personal writings.
Great, thank you for this, Hazem. And again, we're talking about Hazem's translation of Ghassan Kanafani's text, The Revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine, published by 1804 Books. And Hazem, I think this is important because my next question for you after my question for Layan will deal with the implications of engaging Kanafani today. But first, I would like to welcome Layan again. And Layan, as someone who wrote the introduction for this important retranslation that Hazem described, and as someone who works with 1804 Books, we're curious about why this particular text made its way into your publishing repertoire, and how does it align with the broader context of your work as Layan and as someone who also is part of 1804 Books?
Thank you, Jihad, and thank you, Hazem. I mean, it's fantastic to hear you answer these questions, and it's so great to be here speaking about this book after a long process of working on this text. So I guess I can start. There's a very simple answer to this question and a much longer answer. So if you don't mind, I'll give you both. 1804 Books, we are a press for people who are in struggle against capitalism, imperialism, and all forms of oppression. So it's really a press that's for people who are concerned with taking up the fight against the conditions that are unjust and that are violent against them and their people. So it's this press also for socialist and internationalist ideas. And like Hazem said, Kanafani is at his core, he is revolutionary, he is an internationalist. And so this is a simple answer as to why you might find this text in our publishing repertoire, because it is an essential and fundamental text, not only for understanding Palestinian history, but for understanding the internationalist and revolutionary resistance for Palestinian liberation. 1804 Books is relatively new. We started a few years ago in the midst of the pandemic with noticing a particular need, which was that young people in this moment where there's crisis upon crisis upon crisis in the United States, across the world, there's more and more war, there's more and more exploitation, are ready to do something about it. And they're looking for ways to better understand what's going on around them and looking to history as well and to theory. And it's difficult to find texts that are directed particularly at this population. There's a wealth of archives, and Marxist.org is one of my favorite websites. And there's so many primary documents that you can find. There's so many interesting books that are coming out, but we wanted to actually curate essential texts that are going to be answering the burning questions that people need in order to continue building organized struggle today. So we published a few books, some of which have also been translations. We've done some new translations of Fidel Castro, some new translations of Chavez and his theory of what 21st century socialism would look like. And we were thrilled to be able to work on and publish and that Hazem was ready to do the translation of this text, because like Hazem said, and I won't repeat, I mean, the translation that's been circulating is fantastic and it's nourished many of us for so many decades. But it was time actually to revise it, to do a new translation that really brought the spirit of what Kanafani was trying to communicate to his contemporaries, and that I think is important that he communicates to us here today. Very quickly, I'll just say 1804 books also, we've named it 1804 books for the year 1804, which is the year of the Haitian Revolution, which I think is an important place for us to start as a press located in the Americas. And it's an important reference point for us as the first revolution that overthrew colonialism, the first revolution of enslaved workers, and of Black liberation in this region. And that is sort of set the path for us forward. And that I think Kanafani is a very interesting text to put in conversation with this history. So on this book in particular, I was so excited to be working on this book. It's been something that I've learned a lot through this process. I've learned a lot from Hazem. I've learned a lot from the many comrades around the world who have helped guide us and have thought through this process. I've learned a lot from Kanafani. I first came across, if I can maybe tell a little bit of a story, I first came across this text a long time ago. I don't think I seriously studied it though, until a moment that I was in a training course, an international training course for militants who are looking at developing political education. We're thinking through what does revolutionary pedagogy look like. And there were people from all over the world at this gathering, and many young people from the Arab and North African regions. And a few of us were tasked with developing a 1 hour long.
Sorry, everyone, we're having technical difficulties. Jihad is trying to join back in, but we should still be, everyone is still here. So please, Leanne, continue. Jihad will join momentarily.
Great. All right, so we were tasked with doing a 1 hour presentation on Palestinian resistance. And the few of us that were tasked with preparing this presentation started thinking, okay, what should we include? What should we include? And we thought, okay, we could start in the 1970s. No, we can't. We have to start in 1967. No, we can't. We have to start in 1948. No, we can't. We have to keep going back and back and back in history in order to adequately explain why we've reached the point that we are at now, and what are the different opportunities and challenges that the Palestinian struggle is facing. And we were overwhelmed by this reality in that to understand Palestine today, you have to understand the history of the Palestinian struggle, and it has to go before the Nakba, because the Zionism is not something that started in 1948. Israel didn't just come into existence when it declared itself so. And to start there, we miss a lot of the essential economic and political conditions and also interests that still affect the Zionist aggression and that the Palestinian resistance has to confront. So we ended up just focusing on the text by Kanafani, the 1936 to 1939 revolution. And since then, this text has been, at least for me personally, a great reference point for many reasons. One is that, of course, the history that it's giving is essential. And if you haven't read the text, I very much recommend everyone does. It's a short text. Hazem's translation is so beautiful and is very easy to read. And what it does actually is something very, very, very advanced. I think what Hazem said is very correct. Kanafani was not necessarily trained as a historian or as an economist. He actually struggled in school in many different ways because he was so rebellious and revolutionary and had so much of a commitment to his people that he wasn't committed necessarily to developing himself in a particular discipline. He was committed to revolutionary activity. He started off in the Arab nationalist movement, and then he was part of the group that founded the PFLP. He was constantly active and contributing and strategizing and pushing things forward, and writing was only one of those tools that he used to do that. He was an organizer, he was a revolutionary leader, he did so many things. But he felt at the time that it was the late 1960s, early 1970s, right before his assassination really, that he was taking on this kind of task. He felt that he needed to look into this history. And I thought it was very interesting, the timing of all of this. 1967 was a devastating moment for the Arab resistance, not just the Palestinian resistance. And I won't go into it. I'm sure there's many historians on the call, and everyone here is familiar with this history. But it's a moment when the Arab nationalist movement suffered so much defeat and needed to reorganize. And it also invigorated a much greater and wider forms of resistance at the same time. Things were shifting, the headquarters of the armed resistance was moving, and Kanafani was dealing with all of these changing conditions, and he chooses to go into a study of 1936 to 1939. And that's very significant. It shows the kind of strategic thinker that he was, which was that, okay, we are confronting a complexity of challenges here. It's not just about one battle or two battles. It's about all the different correlation of forces, both that are aligned and not aligned or against us, that we need to be evaluating and analyzing so that we can intervene in a precise way and push the resistance forward. And the example he took was this revolution. And he took the time to interrogate it with the limited resources that he has. And give us not just a political analysis, not just an economic analysis, but a social and cultural analysis of this period of history in order to better understand where the failures were and where the successes could be. And it's so significant that he wrote it in this time, because I think there's many parallels between the two periods. And I think for us today, it's very important for us to be also investigating this period. We are also in a similar era of there's a new correlation of forces emerging. Every day there's new alliances on the geopolitical level, on the national levels, in the level of social struggle. There's so many different ways that we need to be understanding the world around us, and it's difficult. But we can look to people like Kanafani to help us show the method to do this. And that's the other reason why I am so excited about this publication, because beyond just being a history, this text is also an example of how to study history and how to do an analysis of conditions. We have words for this. We have one phrase that comes from Spanish, which is conjunctural analysis. Another way of saying this is a concrete analysis of context. Kanafani really dug himself into a particular moment, and he looked at all the different variables. And he did this in a scientific manner. And he didn't take the human condition out of that scientific approach. He thinks about people's desires, people's emotions. You can see that he is a very sensitive person. That's an understatement based on his literary works. And it's interesting that you pointed out, Hazem, the difference between some of his political writings and his literary writings. It shows that how he thinks about the human being as a whole person. It's not just, people aren't just put into economic classes or in political positions. People are human beings who have very complex relationships with each other and with the world around him. And Kanafani was committed to understanding that. And you can see it even in this text. It's not a mechanical text. I think, it's not something that's just, he's giving us the data and he's drawing a conclusion from it. He's putting all of these different moving dynamic things, and then he's drawing some lessons from it. And that's a beautiful example for us. I think that we are, especially in North America, there's a total destruction of our own historical memory and a theft from the dominant form of education. They've stolen from us many of our revolutionary references. And so sometimes we look at history with a very romantic eye. We see the beautiful art that have come out of the 1960s and 1970s. We see revolutionary leaders, and we see them as almost dehumanized symbols of ideals, of revolutionary ideals. And that's dangerous in a sense, because then we miss some of the lessons that they can give us. We are also human beings who are navigating a very complex world at the personal scale up to the geopolitical scale. And so we have to be developing strategies for building organization with other complex human beings that can respond to that. And I think Kanafani gives us a very good example of how to do it. And the last thing I'll say on that point is the fact that he, with all of the political responsibilities that he had, he's editing a paper, he's writing for his own paper and for many others, not only under his own name. I mean, and he has a family, and he's doing so many different things, and he still insists on taking the time to do this kind of historical investigation, I think is also a lesson for us. And about how important it is that we actually engage in this kind of historical investigation ourselves. I saw there was a question that was already raised, and I'll just speak to it really quickly, because this text always makes me think of, there's a very beautiful essay by Krupskaya, who was Lenin's comrade in arms. Some people know her as his wife, but I think she was a lot more than that. And she was writing her recollections of Lenin after he died. And there's a beautiful selection of those where she describes how even in moments when he would, there would be some major victory or some major turmoil, and there would be all sorts of comrades gathered around in his environment, in his house, wherever he was, he would leave everybody and he would go read Marx. And it's not because he was antisocial. It wasn't because this was his comfort thing. It's because he had burning questions that he needed to put in dialogue with a theorist like Marx to help him reach an answer. And that's really the sense I get from this text as well. Kanafani is not doing this as an intellectual exercise. He's not doing it to be a historian, to give the most thorough history, to give an encyclopedia of knowledge, to say, I've accumulated this wealth of knowledge and I am now an expert. He's really in dialogue with the history. He has questions and he wants the answers to them. And no one can actually come up with answers to a question on our own, in our head. We have to put it in dialogue with the right conversation partner. And in this moment, the right conversation partner was the history of this revolution. And so for me, that's really what I see this text. It's such a beautiful text that not only teaches us some essential history that we need to know to understand the context of the Palestinian struggle today and the struggle against imperialism today at the same time, because if we separate the Palestinian resistance from anti-imperialist resistance, or separate Zionism from their imperialist bankrollers, we will miss the plot. But it's also a text that really teaches us how to learn from not just history, but the conditions around us. And I think it's something that we need more and more people to read. I'm just so glad that we were able to do this translation so that it can be given in its entirety to the English-speaking world. There's so many, and from here I hope that it can be translated also again into other languages, because it's something that I hope this generation can learn from, and I think that will strengthen many people who have similar questions that Kanafani was asking in his own time.
Wonderful, Leanne. Thank you so much for this amazing answer. And there are some of the things you highlighted actually are linked to my next question to Hazem about Kanafani's nonfiction writing and how to engage Kanafani as a writer and as a thinker and as an intellectual who tried to analyze certain aspects of Palestinian history in order to draw lessons for the present and for the future. And my question for you, Hazem, is twofold and deals with this issue here. Kanafani is part of the conversation. We hear about him. His literary work is pretty well known in Palestinian circles and beyond. And I think he's primarily known for his literary writing and contributions. So if you could talk a little bit about the significance of his nonfiction writing, most of which hasn't been translated to English. And of course, we will talk about the question of translation later on today, but regardless of the audience, whether it's Arabic speaking or English speaking, how important is Kanafani's nonfiction writing, and how can it inform our thinking and understanding about and with regards to Palestine today? And then if you could elaborate a little bit about the different ways you observe people engage with Kanafani. What Leanne described as sometimes, treating those intellectuals or writers or authors as these dehumanized symbols, treating their words as scripture rather than engage with these texts in dynamic ways that put them in conversation with the present rather than refer to them in this in ways that lack that kind of engagement. So again, a question about the importance of Kanafani's nonfiction writing and how do we engage Kanafani today?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I think Layan really got at some of how I would answer that, but I will maybe like recapitulate some of it. But I think we need to break it down. I think first of all, well, one thing I would say to start is Palestinians have a generational rupture that happened with Oslo. With the early 90s, with the defeat and the surrender at Oslo. So for instance, I've been fortunate and privileged enough to have spent a little bit of time around what we would think of as the generation of the 70s and 80s. And so these are people who would have met Kanafani, who would have been part of his social circle and so on, and would have been reading him as things were being published. And we're part of that conversation. And I think for people born from the late 70s onwards, the generation of Oslo and after, effectively it maps onto millennials. We don't have that depth. I mean, some of us have spent a fair bit of time trying to undo that rupture by going back and talking to people and reading and trying to figure it out. And it feels like a lifetime's worth of work just to kind of put that back together again and try to understand what that is and recreate that continuity across those generations. So I think one of the things that happened is in light of that kind of massive absence, our generations, because it's no longer just one generation, there are multiple of us now, basically kind of grasped at some symbols that could inform our identity, not just as Palestinians, but as people who want Palestinian liberation and want it as part of a broader global Arab and global liberation. And so you get these symbols like Layla Khalid holding a machine gun. A lot of it is women holding machine guns or men holding machine guns or people with kufiyas. And so like that's that symbol of the armed struggle and a militancy. And we can kind of understand where that comes from. Part of it is the kind of like tatriz, hummus, knafe, dabke, kind of like these things that are coded as like the folklore and ours, and we get incensed when Israelis use them on their El Al flights or call hummus Israeli or something like this. Like there's that kind of thing. And then you have the extremely rich, like I don't think we realize just how rich the cultural and intellectual production of the Palestinian Revolution was. One just slight but ever so massive example is the magazine that was called Shu'un Falastiniya. Shu'un Falastiniya for all, which would mean translates as Palestinian Affairs. Shu'un Falastiniya on the outside looks like an academic journal. And if you look at a table of contents, it looks like, and actually that's where this text was originally published, was in Shu'un Falastiniya. This text is effectively like what journals are for academics. This was a space for revolutionaries from all over the world to engage in what academics would use academic journals for. Revolutionaries could use this for revolution, and specifically, and the focal point was the Palestinian revolution, but they were pulling in and commissioning, but also translating existing writings and literary works and book reviews and cultural reviews from all over the place. And Ghassan was a regular contributor until he was killed. In fact, I think one of the final things he ever wrote was he basically sent it to Anis Sayegh, who was the editor, just before he was murdered. Anis Sayegh puts that in the first issue of Shu'un Falastiniya that comes out after Kanafani's murder. And there was also an attempt on Anis Sayegh's life around the same time, actually. So Kanafani really sort of is a massive part of that, not only because of his writings, but actually in his role as editor. So this is something that I think needs to also be brought in. It's like we need words to be like, he was an artist and he was a literary critic and a literary writer and a historian and a political economist. He's all of these things. But one of the great things that Kanafani did was he was an editor, and an editor isn't just someone who fixes your spelling mistakes. It's someone who's an enabler. So for instance, I think it gets dropped out, for example, Najil Ali, the artist behind Handala. Maybe some of the people in the audience don't know who that is, but they would probably recognize Handala if they saw an image, which is sort of this 10-year-old boy. We only ever see him from his back because he bears witness to the caricature, to whatever the subject of the character is. Najil Ali's first ever publications, he was a janitor at the newspaper. And he was kind of discovered by Kanafani, who published the first 3 ever published. They didn't include Handala yet. Handala hadn't been born. But Kanafani was the person editing this stuff. He was the person kind of bringing these people together. He didn't agree with half of what he published, but the idea was that he would enable these conversations to happen. He would enable these because the revolution would be stronger if these things were on paper and in that kind of like public type of forum rather than behind the closed doors. And so it's also no surprise the ethic he had behind this role as an editor was actually the line he chose as the kind of masthead line for Al Hadaf, the main paper he's remembered for. We've forgotten that he was actually the editor for many other journals and papers before that, from Al Ra'i to Al Hurriya to was something that would translate as kind of like the truth and nothing but the truth for the masses, right? It's actually an exquisitely revolutionary idea and goes completely counter to any kind of vanguardism. We need to be 10 steps ahead of the masses because they're stupid. We need to have conversations behind closed doors because, secrecy is the way that we save the security. No, for Kanafani, it was like, if there is truth, everyone needs to have access to this truth. That is the only way this revolution is a real revolution, right? And that's on every issue of Al Hadaf. It's right there on the cover page. So Kanafani as editor. I think Kanafani as artist, I think this was his vocation, right? So I'm not someone who knows much about art, and I find it a little bit, I don't know, I cringe a little bit at the thought of kind of like a Kanafani being treated as a Da Vinci, as a painting, and becoming this incredibly valuable commodity in art collections that then gets exhibited around the world and whatnot. And I'm pretty sure he would not feel very happy about that. I think that would is a kind of a disrespect to his memory in a lot of ways. But I think in terms of nonfiction, by the way, this is not the only translation of Kanafani to come out in the last year. This also came out in the last year. So his very important essay on Zionist literature was translated by Liberated Texts and Ebb Books by a translator named Mahmoud Najib, and he's done a fantastic job. And there's actually some wonderful material in the beginning. There's an essay, a kind of intro text here by Annie Kanafani that is incredibly personal, but really tells us a lot about Kanafani, the human at home, making time to make art with his children. When he was murdered, he was taking his little beloved niece out for a day around town in Beirut, right? So like Layan said, this is somebody who in his complexity was very much sort of like making this time as a person with his family and so on. But the reason I'm bringing it up is not just to plug the translation of On Zionist Literature. It's between On Zionist Literature and the Revolution of 1936. When we read these, remember, this is being written in the early 70s. The method that Layan highlighted, Kanafani's method, it's not just that it's masterful use of what we would think of as kind of political economy, and Layan very correctly sort of brings out these notions of conjectural analysis and concrete analysis of context and so on. It's basically, so for instance, for me, like the one of the most memorable things about this book was the way that he brings in proverbs and songs that were used in 1936 as a way of accessing kind of collective mentalities. And so he'll bring out, for example, these proverbs that are encouraging people to be quietists and just accept their lot. Kind of things. The eye will not rise above the brow. Only spread your feet as far as your blanket will go. This kind of thing of just like, be quiescent, accept what you have. And so he collects these proverbs to kind of give us a sense of what's going on. And you'll see this done directly on Kanafani's model by Basel al-A'raj later on in his writings, another person who was murdered by the Israelis for being such a revolutionary. But I mean, what I'm getting at here is basically at the time he's writing this is before Western academia has things like Foucault and discourse analysis, before cultural studies, right? He's using a method that if I told you this was published in 2008, you'd be like, oh, this guy has read their Foucault and knows their Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and knows how to kind of like, because before the 70s, it was all about studying ideology. But the more latent types of kind of cultural analysis that people have, the stuff that sits at the back of the head and not informs what we think, but informs about how we think about how we think, what questions we ask, how we conceive of the possible. That's what he's doing. And this is, I'm not trying to just like beef him up, read the text, you'll see it's really actually quite obvious that he has reached a level of analysis just by sheer engagement with this material, by thinking, by also being a practitioner of revolution in his own lifetime and recognizing that people don't, if you publish an article that says this is the correct analysis, that's not, just because you're pushing a certain ideology, that's not how people read things. People read critically, they read alongside other things, they argue back mentally as they're reading. And so to just read a text and say, oh, this text says like we should, this is the case, doesn't mean that all the readership are going to take that at face value. And so he tries to dig deeper into, okay, what is it that's actually informing the ways people are seeing the world? So I would sort of build on what Layan was saying about Kanafani's method as a person who's like, well, if I need to understand this, I need to think about political economy and how culture fits in with that. That's precisely what cultural studies is, right? This and it's maybe kind of veered off course from its original founders in many ways and lost a lot of its actually revolutionary spirit. But that revolutionary spirit is alive and well in Kanafani's writings, long before they become things that become like standard reading in university lecture halls. So I think, to go back to the question, it's about kind of recognizing that. Well, I think also another thing to mention, yesterday, Mondoweiss published a really beautiful piece, actually by the editor of this translation, Louis Alday. And he called it A Race Against Time. And this is actually one of the first things I ever learned about Kanafani was that he had diabetes. So I met somebody who was a kind of PFLP cadre, young PFLP cadre at the time. So obviously within the PFLP, there's a lot of lore around Kanafani. He's treated as a hero. And actually in terms of like how that generation is remembered, I want to just also kind of highlight how within the factional terrain of Palestine, different cultural icons who are attached to particular factions get used by members of those factions against members of other factions. It's like, we had Najil Ali, Layla Khalid, and Ghassan Kanafani. Who did you have? There's a kind of like PFLP approach to this. So there's a lot of lore around them. And part of the lore around Kanafani, and it turns out to be actually quite true, is because he had this diabetes, he was convinced he was going to die young. He thought the diabetes was going to kill him, but he was convinced he was going to die young. And so he was in this race against time. And this is part of the reason why he was so like really unbelievably prolific. So within that, to think about he's primarily a revolutionary, and he's trying to use these different media and these different things that he's able to do with a pen and a paintbrush and speaking and enabling as an editor and reading, but then like discussing with, the Danish communists who were within his wife's network who would come visit them in Beirut and then telling them about what Danish media needs to do, going to the writers' conferences in China and India and discussing with people there about what they need to do. So in every single avenue where he has some kind of power or agency to basically use these media, use these avenues to further the cause of global revolution, and particularly Palestinian liberation, and not Palestinian liberation a la nationalists, let's just create another dictatorship, but an actual, this was another thing that Kanafani was part of his legacy for the Palestinian revolution that has been really kind of pushed back on, even within his own faction, which is that liberation is not the liberation of Palestine, it's the liberation of the people. It's the liberation of Palestinians. It's not the liberation of, the way that they would be phrased is تحرير الأرض, مش تحرير الإنسان وليس تحرير الأرض. The liberation of the people, not the liberation of the land. This isn't just about that thing that almost sort of semi-fiction of like, the country. It is about society and human beings being emancipated and what that means. And so, that I haven't been very organized in answering this question. I've kind of jumped around from the editor to the method to the spirit of what he was trying to instill, the kinds of messages that come in through the artwork and the literary analysis and the historical analysis and the journalistic and op-ed and editorializing kind of writing. And I think this was the agenda, right? And he was also well placed to do this. His talent was recognized at age 19. George Habash gives him the Arab nationalist movement's main newspaper to edit, right? He's not even 20 years old when that starts. And he's like a teacher at the Anwar School in Damascus, like who studied some lit at Damascus U, at the University of Damascus, to take on this kind of task and then to be up for the task, right? And to beyond excel at it, to kind of produce material that until today inspires and informs. And also, it's not nostalgia. It's when we have these kinds of people in our past, they become people that in Arabic we'd say like they help us raise our heads up high. So there's also an element of that pride in having Kanafani almost standing behind us and pushing us forward, that on a very almost emotive, affective level is something that also enables us to continue to draw strength from him. The literary works are fantastic. There's really only 4 novellas that he wrote. Beautiful, wonderful, incredibly impactful. I think Aed ila Haifa, for example, is incredibly unexpected from someone who's the ideologue for the Popular Front, right? Someone who basically the main argument of returning to Haifa is being Palestinian or Israeli or Zionist has nothing to do with what genes you were born with, and everything to do with your solidarities, allegiances, and where you stand, your actions, your choices. And this is again why I say that when somebody translates Kanafani and makes him out to be a nationalist, you're completely missing the point. He's not about what blood type do you have, or who were you born to, or who's your father, or what clan are you from, or what city do you hail from, or whatever. It's all about what choices you make, and the allegiances what do you stand for, what do you fight for, and what will you bleed for.
Thank you so much, Hazem. And I have one more question for both of you, actually. And I would love to hear more from Layan, of course, on your perspective on translation as a form of resistance and empowerment, communicating these things that Hazem talked about in your framing of Kanafani that you talked about earlier. In this case, it's Kanafani, but I think this is, a much bigger question here. And I did some translations back in the day, and I think translation is something that it's an act that requires familiarity with the context of those who we are translating about their works, or communicating their ideas to an audience that speaks a different language. So can you share some reflections on translation as a form of resistance and empowerment, and what are some of the opportunities and challenges that it offers? And if you have examples from working on this particular text. You and Hazem, of course, we will be happy to hear from you about that. And then after you answer this question, and Hazem, we will turn to some questions that we have from the audience.
Well, maybe I can start because I think Hazem will have more to say as a much more experienced translator on the act of translation itself. I can give a few thoughts to it. I also end up doing translations sometimes. I think it's a task that we all have to do at different moments, especially if we're engaged in struggle. It's actually unavoidable. And it's a very challenging, very difficult, and very fulfilling task. And I kind of, if you permit me to talk about it beyond just translating from one language to another, because I think in particular, Kanafani, when we try to communicate with another person or express a concept to another person, that in itself is translation. And I think Kanafani, what he's doing in a lot of his writings is particularly this. It's important for us in particular to move back to your specific question. I think it's essential for us to be able to translate these essential texts, these foundational texts, and not for any less of a reason in that if we don't do it, if we don't study the wealth of political theory and history from across the world, we will not have the strategies that we need to build struggle today. I think actually I see somewhat less of a contradiction between Kanafani's political work and his literary work, because both of them to me seem to be very fundamentally Marxist approaches to reality, which is a very human and accepting of contradictions in its approach. And he, in a sense, he in this text that he's this one text, but in the many other texts that he's doing, he's giving us a Marxism that is based on the conditions that he's in. He's not copy pasting from another person, which is actually counter to what I think Marxism actually is. He's engaging with other theoreticians. He's engaging with other revolutionaries. He's criticizing them. He's agreeing with them. He's using this sarcasm that makes his text very difficult to read for someone who is not advanced in Arabic language. It's very difficult to read his Arabic text because he's actually doing a lot of subtext. There's a lot of irony. I struggled through a lot of his political writings, and that's why we're so glad Hazem could help guide us through this process, because he's a very sharp writer and he's thinking on many different levels. But what he's giving us are the things that we need to understand a Marxism rooted in the Palestinian struggle. I mean, and this is why I think that he is such an important person for the PFLP and for the revolutionary movement overall. There's other contemporaries of his. There's Mahdi Ahmed from Lebanon, from the Lebanese Communist Party, did something very similar in many of his texts. There's people all around the world. If you read, we've been studying here Ho Chi Minh. We'd studied Ho Chi Minh for about a year. The other texts that we've published, we've had a similar thinking about this, is that these are people who are giving us a Marxism that is rooted in their conditions. They can help us understand how to do a Marxism that is rooted in our conditions, wherever we are. And in a sense, that invokes some of the skills you need to do for translation, because we need to be able to read his text, understanding the conditions around him and not just the words that he's saying. I think also we are in a moment where we have imperialism and the neoliberal forms of economy and the kinds of ways that the attacks on since 1991, the attacks on internationalist resistance have been so intense that we are living in a moment where everyone is isolated in many ways. People have been pushed to fight against each other rather than with each other. There's a internationalist consciousness that has been taken away from many of us in the younger generation. And we need to be rebuilding the institutions, the mechanisms, the alliances that are going to allow us to understand and engage with struggles across contexts, across the world. And to do that, we're going to have to study the histories of struggle. We're going to need to rebuild these things. And I think that the only way that we can do that is to understand the people who are pushing forward the strategy and the theory and producing that theory in those particular conditions. And Kanafani is someone that I think is a reference that we cannot miss. So for me, I think this translation is extremely important. I can't say how important it is to have this translation done. because it's not only going to facilitate reading outside of in the English language world, but it will also help facilitate. I mean, there's a huge gap between, it's very difficult to read Arabic for people who are in the Romance languages, for example. So this is really something that I think will help contribute to the study of Palestinian resistance and to understanding how we can be in more than in solidarity, but fight alongside the Palestinian people wherever we are in the world. I'll leave it there because I think Hazem, as the translator for this text, I think you have a lot more to say on this topic.
I mean, I have a lot to say about translation, obviously, but I think it needs one thing to say is that, like, I don't think we can treat translation as one thing, first of all. So we need to kind of like zoom it down to what is this translation. Let's not forget that translation, for example, major early kind of forms of translation were things like translations of the Bible in order to conduct missionary activity in communities and convert them forcibly and otherwise to a religion of empire and render entire societies kind of as part of pacifying and destroying particular societies and their ways of life. That, for example, 18th and 19th century, the major bulk of translation, as it was in Abbasid Baghdad, as it was in 18th and 19th century Europe, it was a way of kind of like domesticating the knowledges of the world for projects about centralized state power, whether this is the Abbasid Empire or these kind of European empires, what we would now call Orientalism, following Edward Said, of rendering the other as a text that you can then use as a tool of power, but power used to subjugate. So translation can be many things, and most of the translation that's happening out there has nothing to do with liberation or emancipation, everything to do with something else, usually quite the opposite. For me, why would I translate a text like this? Kind of quite specific type reasons. So I'm not going to philosophize about on translation. This is not a treatise titled On Translation. The one, I think, one of the things with that kind of generational rupture, there's a lot of positive that comes from the generational rupture of defeat. One of those for me is a rethinking of what it means to be Palestinian. There is a trope in the revolution that Kanafani is a part of the Palestinians, a very particular type of person. It's somebody who speaks Arabic, lives in a particular kind of place, eats particular kind of food, dresses a kind of way, for instance. But today, it really sort of erases the fact that there are more Palestinians in Chile alone today than there are Palestinians in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt combined. So what it means to be, what is a Palestinian is actually it always was heterogeneous, but even more so today, at least linguistically. And so we have an immense amount of Palestinians out there who do not read Arabic and will not have a chance to read Kanafani. And even if they can make out the words, like Leanne said, I mean, Kanafani is not the most complex Arabic you're going to encounter, but it's definitely complex enough that you're going to miss a lot if you're not catching the references and you're not catching the sleight of hand and the humor, because Leanne really picked up on it. He's a hilarious human being. Like, he's someone I really wish we could just like hung out with and drank together and hear his jokes, kind of. So it's, for me, like, one of the primary audiences for this text is actually Arabs and Palestinians who don't read Arabic and would not encounter this text otherwise. A second kind of target for me, again, this was not mine, and it is not mine, but I have my own motives for why I did it. And so a second motive was also to kind of set the record straight in terms of the answer to the first question of the existing translation slightly misrepresenting who Kanafani is and some of the translator's choices. And I'm not the only person who noticed this. I remember one of the first things I heard about Kanafani was that, like, one of the only things we have of his in English is this translation. of the revolution of 1936, but it's not fit for purpose. It's not fit for the task anymore. And so to just kind of like almost like set the record straight in a way of like, this is what I hope is a bit closer to the original for what it is. And a third is for also like revolutionaries globally to recognize this, the way that we look at Amilcar Cabral and Audre Lorde and Huey P. Newton and there's kind of revolutionaries from all over the world and the texts that they produced and the speeches that they gave. This is part of that library. This is part of kind of revolutionary humanities canon. And if it wasn't recognized as such before, it should be recognized now, not because we translated this, but as we have more and more like these texts that just in the past year are coming out, this renewed interest in Kanafani, not just as a symbol, not just as a video clip of an interview he did in Beirut where he tells a journalist to fuck off, but as somebody who's engaged in this. If you're going to say Kanafani, don't just think of that picture, or don't reduce him to his death, the murder. Don't reduce him to the Men in the Sun and the handful of novellas and short stories that have been translated. There's so much more. And here in particular is where he really enters into that kind of global revolutionary canon, I think, in this text. And it deserves to be something that a young Tamil child in Sri Lanka, or a young Kurdish, or an old Kurdish auntie in Kurdistan, or any of these people around the world are also able to kind of access somehow. If this encourages translation into further languages, if it enables a Kurdish translator to help them figure out how to render this in Kurdish or in Tamazight or then that would be math. That's really kind of a big part of this. And I think third is for the broader English reading audience to recognize, Kanafani is the kind of person who's been incredibly vilified. Netflix just put out a documentary about like covert ops, and there's 2 episodes about the assassinations of the Black September folks. And so it's basically just like Mossad as hero and the Palestinian resistance as just terrorists. So whatever, for 20 plus years and then some, we've really kind of been talking about this trope of terrorism and 9/11 and all this and pushing back on it. So we don't need to labor this point. The point I do want to labor a little bit is that for me, like Kanafani, the fact that he's so human and such a genuine internationalist, where he basically starts the book by analyzing the situation of the workers and immediately goes to the Communist Party, which is a Jewish party, and talking about how are they discussing it. So it's almost like he's saying, well, naturally, the first point of call for our analysis of workers in Palestine is going to be the Communist Party. It happens to be Jewish, fine. What are they doing about it? At no point is their Jewishness part of the reason for why they messed up. He actually is like, well, they actually almost got there, but then didn't. I'll leave it to you to read the text to see what happens. Like no spoilers. So just to kind of like see what does it mean to be a Palestinian internationalist? Because I think that's something that since I became politicized and radicalized, I've been craving that, right? We're surrounded by Palestinian nationalists and flag waving, a flag that doesn't really represent, this is I'm not going to do too many tangents, but these kinds of like things about nationalist symbolism that are emptied of any of that kind of meaning. And here you have a text where you actually get to fill in that meaning. What does it mean to look at the world as this kind of revolutionary internationalist? And the book kind of answers that, even though it's not aiming to. But by, like Layan said, by looking at the method, by looking at the approach, by looking at the spirit with which he engages the subject, you get a sense of what it means to be a revolutionary internationalist. And so I think it's valuable for people who want to be that, but it's also valuable as a testament that these people you're calling terrorists, that you are celebrating the Mossad for murdering, this is what you're murdering. You're murdering people who have been humanizing all of you all along. But if you're on the side of oppression, then you are to be fought against, not because you are any less human, but because you are structurally in a position where you're destroying people's lives.
Thank you, Hazem. Before we address some of the questions from the attendees, Layan has something to say, so please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add, thank you, Hazem. I just wanted to add one small thing that I forgot to mention. One very important note on this new translation is that the title has changed. It's no longer The Revolts of 1936. I know it's backwards on the screen, perhaps, I'm not sure, but it's The Revolution of 1936 to 1939, which for me is so amazing to see revolution and Palestine big on a book cover. And also, I think the message that Kanafani is giving in this text and that he gave with his life is much more clear with this choice of wording, which is, I think, much more correct in that it's not an unorganized revolt of the Arab masses who are dehumanized in their sense that they're not architects of their own struggle. This was an organized struggle, and Kanafani makes that very clear. And the resistance continues to be an organized struggle through the organizations that Kanafani himself was a part of, the PFLP, other parties, and the social movements. And these are organized struggles that the Palestinian and Arab people are building. And I think this is such an important example of how one small change in the translation, one small decision in how you translate a text can actually shift the message of the text enormously. And I'm just very glad that it's out in this version.
Thank you so much, Layan. And just a quick reminder to all those attending, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book or pre-order, my colleague Muhammad here has he made the link available in the chat, and I think Muhammad, if you don't mind sharing it again for those who joined later on, so that we can also get the link. So we'll take some questions from the attendees, and for those who have questions for Hazem and Layan, this is your opportunity to post them using the Q&A feature, or you can also do that in the chat. I would like to start with a question from Azad Isa, who I think, and Azad's question here takes us back to the substance of Ghassan's study of the 1936 revolution. And I think, you know, it's a reflection on the relevance of today's reality in light of Ghassan's analysis. So what Azad, just reading Azad's question quickly, he talks about the question of failed / corrupt Palestinian leadership, that it's a recurring theme when it comes to the understanding of what happened over the past 100 years in Palestine. Is there anything within Kanafani's writing or within this book or others that explains the failure of Palestinian leadership as compared to the leaders of other revolutionary movements? Layan and Hazem, feel free to answer this question.
I can't see the question anymore. It seems to have disappeared. But am I understanding right? Does the book address the issue of why the Palestinian leadership is
failed compared to the leaderships of other revolutionary movements around the world?
Interesting. Well, first of all, let's remember that he's only talking about the 30s. He may be dog whistling a little bit about the kind of Fatah and Arafat, which I think he is. But effectively, the answer is yes. And obviously, he's going to do it way better than my little summary of it here. And hopefully Layan can also kind of fill in what I missed. But for me, the main thing that I see Kanafani saying on this particular point is basically you have a leadership that is structurally and naturally and actively inclined to try to position itself as the crony of the imperial overlord. It's sort of, the Zionists beat them to it in a way. The Zionist leadership and the Zionist movement position themselves in that place as the Jewish bourgeoisie in Palestine is in the process of trying to do a far-reaching reorganization of the political economy of the space into an industrial capitalist space, with all of the social ruptures and dislocations that that's going to cause. This Palestinian leadership is now in a position where they've lost the one source of power that they have, which is that kind of superior authority, the Ottoman kind of the Istanbul, which is now London. And so they are left with very few options. He uses this gorgeous metaphor about the social movement as a kind of a wave. And so he has them kind of like catching up with the wave, like surfers, to try to get to the crest. And it's just like barely in their reach, to try to get and say, no, we're the leaders of the national movement. We are going to be the leaders of this resistance movement to the British occupation and Zionist colonization. But it's very awkward for them because they don't want to be there. That's not, they're constantly trying to find that moment that's going to enable them to be like King Abdullah in Jordan, or one of these other kind of like crony regimes that has managed to just kind of become the intermediary between the imperial power that's delivering the subjugation of the local population and imperial interests. And so that's a position that's doomed to failure, basically. So he's highlighting how that contradiction of the sort of unwitting place at the helm of a national movement that you have no interest in because it's a flattener, right? If you have an actual uprising, that's going to be an uprising where class, gender, etc. is going to come up, and your patriarchal land-owning role is going to come into jeopardy. You have no interest in a social revolution that's actually going to create any kind of equality and fairness in a society, because you're going to lose all of that privilege and power that the status quo had before the British occupation, and that you're striving towards as a future status quo in which you have those privileges guaranteed once again. And I think it's an extremely cogent explanation, and I think it fully, or I think it's extremely cogent also in understanding Fatah and Oslo and the Palestinian Authority. It's the exact same dynamic. When things are going not very well and there's a mass movement and whatnot, you get Abu Mazen coming up and saying something that's coded as resistance-oriented. But at the rest of the time, and even at those times, he's still continuing security coordination and trying to be the Israel. It's just that London is now Tel Aviv / West Jerusalem. And the Palestinian Authority leadership, which has let go of the entirety of Palestinians outside of the West Bank and now Gaza in terms of the Ramallah Authority, on this little kind of island, apartheid islands of settler colonial kind of scraps, is just constantly trying to play that exact same contradiction, which we have recognized is not just doomed to fail, has been a failure from the start. And the same with the Palestinian leadership in the 30s. It was a failure from the start. There was never this moment where it had any chance as a leadership of doing anything. What did again in the 70s, Layan was very right in pointing out that we have these kind of like moments that are actually quite similar, and that the 30s, the 70s, and now share these kinds of similarities. You have this kind of like identical dynamic in the 30s, 70s, and now, basically, since the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Hazem. I think maybe I can just add, or maybe I'm even just reiterating. I think this text, in order to understand, is very helpful in helping us understand other national liberation struggles as well, because of the approach that Kanafani took, the method that he used, and the different elements that he analyzed. I think can be very helpful in understanding similar contexts, in particular because he is in a national liberation struggle, which has all classes of the society that is of the nation that is being liberated in the sense. So there's those class contradictions which he lays out very, very well. And I think to speak to both of your questions at the same time, I don't know, and maybe Hazem, you disagree or have more to say on this, but in terms of considering religion, I don't know that he necessarily thinks about religion as one thing in an entirety. He thinks about religion the way it's expressed by the peasantry or by the working classes he thinks about religion when it's being used as a tool by the ruling elite or the landowners to establish their own authority. He doesn't think about it, I think, as a monolithic of thing. He's looking at it in its different uses, whether it's a use to invoke a revolutionary spirit, or whether it's used to justify someone else's position of authority.
Mhm.
And so I think what he does is he helps us complicate a little bit the internal dynamics of a liberation struggle, and along class lines, political lines, and cultural lines, because he's also identifying in these class differences, there are different cultural and religious approaches as well. And so he's laying all these things out for us. And I think it can be very helpful in understanding other contexts, other national liberation struggles, and particularly in that time, in the, from the 1920s to the 70s, 80s, we're seeing across Africa and Asia a lot of moments of liberation struggles that have to deal with these same class contradictions and political contradictions within their own society. So I think it can be helpful in looking at other histories as well.
Thank you, Leanne. There's a long but fascinating question from Adil Muhsin for Hazem, but both of you are welcome to answer it. He says, thanks for translating Kanafani, Hazem, and for editing and publishing this, Leanne. I appreciate the point made about Kanafani's humanist democratic core and his editorial skills, which is in part what I try to bring out in my own writing about him. That said, why do you think Kanafani is too often reduced to an ideologue, communist, PFLPN, Arab nationalist, or otherwise, as opposed to the universal critical theorist that he was in actuality? It seems to me part of a bigger problem of treating third world intellectuals as derivative thinkers versus the original metropolitan theorist. This is especially important when it comes to Kanafani, who in many ways, especially in texts like on Zionist literature and his literary journalism in Arabic, anticipates a good chunk of literary and post-colonial theory that's now the bread and butter of the ivory tower. Any thoughts on this rather long comment/question, yet fascinating, Adi? Thank you.
I think it's a great question. I think you're onto something with the, for lack of just shorthand, I'll just use Orientalism of approaching him as like, he's from the third world, he can't be original, he must be derivative. I mean, I think that's there, but I would maybe caution against just sort of like immediately jumping for that, because it's not like Arabic commentary on him is that much different or more advanced necessarily. Obviously, it's going to be a bit more advanced, is a bit more engaged, especially the people around him, like Jabra Ibrahim Jabra's intro to the collected plays, the Fayha Abdel Hadi's book on Ghassan, etc. Like people who've actually engaged his text, no. But I think the issue is that you don't have that many people who have engaged the nonfiction texts. This Dar al-Rimal, 5th volume of the political writings, is not very widely circulated. It is, so in terms of even like access to these texts, it's limited. Secondly, in terms of engagement, I think there's quite a lot of vested interests in not bringing out this sort of like real Ghassan. In terms of I was saying that he strays from the party line, and that was then, he definitely strays from the party line today, given where the party has reached. And so I think there is a vested interest within the part of the political terrain, official Palestinian political terrain, that that's supposed to be his side, in not actually engaging that part of his approach, writing, analysis, etc. Definitely in terms of the rest of that terrain, there's a vested interest in people just forgetting who Kanafani is and not having that come up at all. Like think of something like Fatah or Hamas. This text, and this is just one of, if we go through his journalistic and op-ed type writing, it goes way further in terms of what I'm about to say, but it's a direct attack on them. It's a direct attack on any kind of donning the mantle of being sort of like a liberation faction or a liberation movement, while continuing to accept narrow factionalism, accept anything less than the complete and total emancipation of the human being, whether it's on the lines of gender, class, etc. And for most of our mainstream political factions, that's all they're about. Religion, I will add there as well. And I think in terms of that kind of like broader Arab world, like I think that like that's maybe where this will be the most interesting, is like in terms of making these texts available. Sadly, and I think you probably know, everybody here probably knows, and this would come into any conversation about translation as well, you often need to get famous in English for people to appreciate you in your original language in your own country. If you can become a celebrity, like if you're a comp-lit professor at Columbia who's of Palestinian origin and writing about Palestine and whatnot, and nobody's heard of you in English, you know, you don't get to be Edward Said. But if you become like this celebrated professor in the English Academy, then you become a national icon back in the Arab world, right? And this is not just an Arab phenomenon, this is a globally existing kind of phenomenon. You need to get big, you know, it's like that song, New York. If I can make it there, I make it anywhere. You need to make it there in order to make it elsewhere. So, but it would be, I think, really incredible if more of the kind of Kanafani's texts in Arabic and other languages were made available to Arab revolutionaries. And kind of if there was more of this sort of like Arab revolutionary canon type awareness and discussion and sharing of these kinds of texts. But I don't know enough to know what kind of reception Kanafani gets. We have a phenomenon with Palestinian political writing and cultural writing that I'm not a big fan of this person, but Mahmoud Darwish already in the 50s clued into. He said, "You're killing us with your love. We need real criticism. We need real engagement with our work, because just if somebody is Palestinian and saying free Palestine, everybody just claps and says, oh, the heroes, the Palestinians, you guys are struggling so good. Then that's not a real engagement. That actually stunts any kind of development and growth of any kind of praxis, any kind of like intellectual and action combo that can become part of like building a liberation movement. And as I said about Kanafani, he's central as an editor in terms of, no, let's do it. Any kind of revolution journal needs to do reviews of the plays that we're watching in the theaters in Beirut. It needs to review literature from all over the world. And if we can't access it, find somebody who can so we can review it, because we need, all of this needs to be part of the conversation, and it needs to be really engaged criticism. None of this rah-rah business. So I think, Adi, that's what I think when I think about why is the rest of Ghassan left out, and we only have the kind of Ghassan as ideologue. And also people's general reduction of people to almost like their job descriptions. Like, oh, he was the editor of the PFLP magazine and a member of their Politburo. He must be an ideologue. What else could he be? And then you just read like Rijal fi Shams, or you just read the fiction, and maybe not even particularly critically, you're not going to have anything to go on to understand even that you were actually wrong in this assumption.
Leanne?
Yeah, I also think this is a very interesting question, and maybe to answer in a brief way, I also think part of what adds to this is that sometimes I think people see someone who is an ideologue or a communist or a party member as something reducible, which I actually think is incorrect. I think just because someone is a party member, party founder, someone who is developing a party ideology doesn't mean that they're not a whole human being, and actually doesn't mean that that's something that reduces their life in any way. I think we do have somewhat of a culture that is not just anti-communist, but is against any form of organization, and that has to do with the immense attack of US neoliberalism on our daily life. I actually encourage everyone to keep their eyes out, because there's a book coming out that we're from 1804 Books, hopefully in the end of the year. That's actually, we're working with the Palestinian Youth Movement to publish. They're editing and developing a translation of the Trinity of Fundamentals by Wissam Rafidi, who is giving an account, a fictional account based on his own experience of being an underground militant during the Intifada years. And he grapples with many of these different things about what it means to be revolutionary and how to develop your party commitments, your party leadership alongside the desires, the needs, the dreams that you have as a human being. And it's a wonderful text. So I hope everyone keeps an eye out for it. I think it can also help answer some of these questions. But certainly I don't think Kanafani can be reduced to being an ideologue, because that's actually something that I think gives him many different things. I mean, I don't think there's a difference. I don't think he could be a universal theorist if he actually wasn't rooted in this collective project of building a party. And I think we have to challenge some of our assumptions that we have about organized struggle, that it doesn't, when you give yourself to a collective, it doesn't make you less. It doesn't make you less of a universal or relatable person. And I also think Kanafani may be somewhat frustrated with some of the post-colonial theory that is, as you said very well, the bread and butter of the ivory towers. I don't know that he would. I think he would be pretty frustrated with the way some readings of his literary works have been taken today, and that they've been divorced from actual concrete revolutionary struggle. I actually think that is a misreading of Kanafani, and it's something that the ivory tower is really good at doing. I read Marx at a university, completely divorced from the idea that it's actually possible to build a workers' revolution. It was just as if it was a cultural piece. This is something that I think academia has excelled at, which is divorcing the actual meaning and context of text from the text. And I think Kanafani would be very frustrated with that. So I'm happy that we can bring more of his political work, because I think that's something that I actually think his literary work is political work. And I think it's very important political work, but because of the level of attacks that we've had on our own consciousness and our ability to read that politics in his literary works today, we need his political texts to help us build back our understanding of what his proposal was for all of us. So I'm really happy we have this text. There's been the Zionist literature text is extremely important. I studied it quite a bit, and I hope there's going to be many more, because we really need to bring as much of his writing to today's audience as we can.
Thank you so much, Layan. Do you both have it in you for one more question? All right. So this is a question that I had here on my notes before my Zoom dropped, and I don't know who the person who asked the question is, but nonetheless, it's a great one, and I think it offers us a note on which we can conclude this conversation for now, because I know we will be continuing this conversation later. And it's a question about the relevance of the principles of liberation as discussed in Kanafani's work to today's context, considering the challenges that face Palestinians today. And I would like to expand a little bit and give you both the opportunity to share, what could count as concluding remarks. In today's world, in this current moment, very challenging moment that Palestinians are witnessing, facing the challenges of imminent ethnic cleansing, continuous ethnic cleansing, this severe assault by this right-wing government in Israel, the collaboration of the Palestinian elite with Israel, all sorts of challenges and concerns. How can a text like Kanafani's inform our analysis today, and how can it give us hope? Especially looking at a text like that talks about a moment of rebellion and a moment of uprising that didn't necessarily go well at the end and paved the path for further destruction of Palestinian life as we saw in the Nakba. If we are about to face another Nakba, what can be done differently now, and how can Kanafani's analysis offer us a way out of such possibility?
Should I go first? I'll leave the last word to Leanne. I think that this is one of the most important types of text to read, specifically on your question, Jihad. And because this is something we see repeated over and over again. One of the first political texts of this kind that I read in my life was a book called The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, which is about the revolution after which this publishing house, 1804 Books, is named, the Haitian Revolution, one of the most important revolutions in human history. And there's a lot of parallels between the Black Jacobins and this text in the sense of this question. You basically have people engage in revolution wholeheartedly, body on the line, and think it will lead to something, and have a certain amount of trust in a kind of leadership that it's going to deliver that, and it's not going to waver, and it's not going to solve the revolution out. And I think whether it's the kind of initial part of that Haitian revolution under Toussaint de Louverture, where he tries to kind of come to an accommodation with the French, who of course then just kill him, or the Palestinian revolution of the 30s, where the leadership is basically just waiting for that moment where they can come in and hijack the revolution that they're ostensibly leading, which then happens again the moment this book is written, because the militant factions, particularly Fatah, takes over the PLO and immediately starts to look for ways to enter negotiations with the Israelis. Immediately, by the early 70s, around the exact same time this book is being written, the leadership of Fatah is trying to send out feelers to the Americans, etc., on how to come to a compromise solution that would enable them to be at the helm. Obviously, this is all rooted in some language about what's realistic and what's pragmatic and whatnot, but it's usually realism and pragmatism in the very short term, what can be done in the next months and years, rather than thinking about the revolution not as an event, but as something that is that freedom and emancipation as something that needs to be is basically a way of life that happens over lifetimes. And then again at the Oslo, where that actually bears fruit, where finally that leadership is able to get access to VIP lounges in Amsterdam and Rome and London and Washington, D.C. in return for surrender. And so I think one of the big lessons in this text is in Kanafani's analysis of what happened in the 30s, which he's looking at, like Leanne said, incredibly sort of like spot on, to help understand his moment in the late 60s and in the early 70s after the defeat in Jordan. Let's not remember, what are we talking about in terms of context? It's the defeat at Black September, which is followed up by an even more important and long forgotten and atrociously forgotten. So September 1970 is when the Jordanian regime, helped by the United States, Israel, Pakistan, etc., come in and just artillery bomb the refugee camps and the PLO camps, full of Arabs from all over the Arab world, of course, and also international revolutionaries from all over. So it's not Palestinian versus Jordanian. It's that regime and its allies versus the kind of revolutionaries from all over the globe. And then in 1971, they basically kind of carpet bomb the woods in northern Jordan where the fighters are stationed. There's a massive massacre that's not talked about of the fighters who were withdrawn to Jarash and Ajloun. So this is what he's reckoning with, a post-defeat type moment to understand what's going on. And in each of these cases, the defeat is facilitated by choices of the leadership, by these people who are posing themselves in this mantle of leader, using the language of a kind of pragmatism and what is realistic in order to ensure their own privileges at the expense of the freedom of the population they're pretending to represent. And I think that's one of the major lessons here. I think there's a lot more in terms of thinking about the political economy, the culture, the proverbs, the kinds of attitudes one approaches life in a revolutionary context. But I think the big kind of, for me, the big punch in this text is about thinking about leadership that is not what it is pretending to be. And the importance of, and the fact that like that leadership's power has two bases to it. It has the power that's given to it by its own imperial overlord, and then the power we give it as people who subscribe to it. And both of those things are incredibly frail, incredibly frail. The leadership, the power given by the imperial overlord is based on the ability to kind of like ensure that people toe the line, ensure that the masses follow that leadership and kind of stick to the program and don't stray. And by people kind of like giving them that authority, the masses giving, the general public, the people engaged in struggle, giving that leadership that authority. By simply just turning around and saying, no, you don't represent me. And I'm oversimplifying. Obviously, the Palestinian Authority today is torturing and imprisoning anybody who speaks against it. So I'm not saying it's this simple. But on some level, it also is this simple in the sense of a mass just, you actually do not represent us, undercuts even the power they get from their own imperial overlords.
Thank you, Hazem. Leanne?
This is a huge question, so I'll do my best, but I think reading this text and reading texts like it gives me a lot of hope, especially for today. In particular, this one, I can stick with this one. This text very much shows, and the many other texts that Kanafani has written, shows how Zionism was designed by people that we can name, with institutions that we can name, and with materials that we can also identify, political and economic and cultural materials. And the same goes for the resistance. The resistance is built by people who are building institutions and organizations and bodies that are carrying out this resistance. And so this gives me a lot of hope. I mean, it's not something inevitable that Zionism or US imperialism is going to be something that lasts forever. It's the architects are nameable, we can identify them. And the strategies that have been developed to counter them are also nameable and identifiable. And texts like this help us do it. And so when we're faced in a very complex moment like we are right now, it can be very easy to think there's no possibility for anything to change. I mean, what is a protest going to do? What is a text going to do? What is a class going to do? What are all these things going to do in the big ocean of violence and massive geopolitical reformation that we're in right now? But it's that inevitability is something that's imposed on us, and that studying examples like Kanafani can help us break away from, because I think it's something that's, one, not true, and two, is designed to keep us from actually doing the things that are going to help us change this reality. If Zionism was enacted by some people and is continuing to be enforced by some people, people can take it down. And I think that's the main lesson that we have to take from all of our study of history and of theory, is that we do have the capacity to build revolution and to change the conditions that are oppressing us. I think it's hard, it's difficult. I don't think we can be idealists. I think the moment that we're in now is even more complex perhaps than the moment that Kanafani was writing in. But it doesn't mean that it's not possible. It is very much possible. So I hope that that's the main message that people take from reading texts like this and from others, that these texts are meant to be read. They're tools for struggle. I mean, Kanafani wouldn't have written this just to write it. He wouldn't have written it if it wasn't going to be used. And he read it with the intention that it would be used by his own comrades in the party and by others. I'm sure he thought of it. I can't speak for that, but I'm sure. Otherwise, why would it be written in this way? So I think, and we should take them as tools, and we should use them as tools, and develop our own texts and our own theories and keep the project forward. I mean, Kanafani lived way too short of a life. He technically should still be here and could still be here, and would give us all sorts of opinions on what we're facing right now. But I think we can also do that too. So I really hope that that's the spirit that people take from reading texts like these. And I'm very interested to see how people engage with this translation and with this text. I know that people have been studying it more and more over the past few years. But I'm very interested to see what kinds of conclusions and conversations are generated through studying this text.
Thank you so much, Layan. And on that note, we conclude this discussion of the new translation of Ghassan Kanafani's study on the 1936 revolt, the revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine, background, details, and analysis. We had the honor of hosting Layan Fulayhan, Hazem Jamjoom. Layan wrote the introduction for the book and Hazem did the translation. Thank you both for your amazing work and for your generosity, giving us almost 2 hours of your time today. This was a wonderful discussion. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure many of the attendees share the same sentiment. Again, make sure to pre-order or order the book. We provided the link in the chat. We will also be sending the link again in our follow-up email to our listserv following this event. We will also be sharing the recording. And get the book, read it, and engage with Kanafani's ideas and writing. And reach out to Hazem and to Layan, invite them to speak about the book with your communities, at your university, with in the spaces where you organize and work. Hazem and Layan, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hosting you again. And thank you all for attending. Just a quick reminder, next week, Thursday, the 21st, we're hosting an educational event about the diabetes crisis in Palestine. 20% of people between the ages of 40 and 69 suffer from diabetes in Palestine. So we're going to talk about this crisis. We're going to feature people who work at the Palestine Diabetes Institute who will tell us about the diabetes crisis in Palestine and ways to address it. So please stay tuned, join us next Thursday. And until then, take care and thank you all.
Thank you, Hazem. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Leah.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone who came.